Good morning, it's Pastor Jennifer, and I am on Kelly Island at the confluence of the Bitterroot and Clark Fork Rivers in Missoula County, Montana. Please join me for a moment of prayer. May the words of my mouth and the meditations of all our hearts be acceptable to you, O God, and may more light and more truth break forth from your holy word. Amen. As we begin our reflection this morning, we are entering into the second Sunday of our series on Earth, our original monastery, reflecting on how nature reveals God to us and how it reveals us to each other. Today we're looking at rivers, and it's a time to look at the confluences of rivers that are occurring within our own historical time and with our own spiritual lives. So the first thing I think of with rivers is this idea that the river is never the same. Heraclitus said that you can never step into the same river twice. And the reason for that is twofold. On the one hand, rivers are constantly changing. The geomorphology of the river banks are always changing. Rocks and islands are emerging and submerging. The rivers are constant in their inconstancy. Now that makes things fun for me as a kayaker, but it makes it a little bit hard to have a dependable source for water and for transportation for those who depend on that reliability. But when we think that the river is always supposed to flow at one rate, that's where we get into trouble. In our spiritual lives, we ourselves are also always changing. The geomorphology of our souls means that sometimes some hazards and challenges emerge while others submerge. And really the challenge is to respect that flow shifts and changes and to make peace with it. To make peace with it and also to look at those strategies and practices that can help cultivate a deeper sense of spiritual life and to let our longings be met by God's grace and refreshment. Now, the other image of rivers that is so powerful for us today is this notion from the prophet Amos. Let justice flow like a river and righteousness like an ever-flowing stream. Yesterday, the verdict came down in the trial of Derek Chauvin. And while for a moment there's justice to be celebrated in that individual case of police brutality, at the same time that verdict was being read, young Ma'Khia Bryant, who had called the police for help as she was in fear of her own life, was actually shot to death by those same police that she had called for help. This reveals to us that while individual moments of justice are to be celebrated, that there is a larger river of fear and suspicion and incorrect assumptions that are currently underlying our public safety system. There needs to be a confluence of the desire for hope and health and healing with our community, with the practices of the police as they are currently defined. My hope and my prayer is that all of us can lean into that path that is restorative for justice and that will instill confidence in the policing in our communities and instill a greater sense of justice for communities, particularly communities of color, that are adversely affected by those systems. Now, the other confluence that we're looking at that's so scary to me is how people are more and more able to and practicing the purchase of assault weapons. That one river of fear that drives people to purchase these weapons that should never be in civilian hands needs to be met by the stronger river of justice and hope that will remove this scourge from our nation. That speaks to me of yet another metaphor for rivers, and that is rivers of healing. I find myself in this time of moving out of the pandemic and emerging into life anew that it's extremely stressful. The pandemic as a whole has been incredibly stressful. And I find myself under that stress, really grasping tightly, trying to control, trying to manage, trying to tighten down my grip on my responsibilities and sometimes even my relationships. But what the river teaches me is to open up, is to let go, to let grace flow through me, let God's love flow through me, let God's hope and let God's peace flow through me. And in that sense of that flow, to let the river heal me. The rivers that are in our community, that are in our larger world, are constantly carrying nourishment, carrying hope, and carrying new life. And that leads me to the last image of a river, and the one that gives me the most hope. When I was 9 years old, my parents moved us from Los Angeles to Eugene, Oregon, which is yet another town bisected by a river, in this case the Willamette. At that time, in 1970, the early 70s, the Willamette was known as an open sewer. It was not habitable for swimming, for drinking from, for fish. It was a mess. But the combined desire and will of the people and the legislation that created the Clean Water Act reestablished the health and safety of that river and so many other rivers. And so the Willamette is now one of my favorite rivers to paddle on and to swim in. I trust the water that comes from that river as it's treated. And I know that with enough love, with enough faith, with enough hope, with enough effort, with enough compromise, with enough of the power and the grace of God, the world can change. That hope can be restored, that love can be renewed. This is what the river finally teaches me. We have one more story of the river that comes to us from the gospel. When Jesus decided to begin his ministry, he came down to the Jordan River where John was baptizing people. The river at that time represented a crossing over place, a place of transformation, from death into life, from old ways into new ways. As Jesus stepped down into that river, he was saying goodbye to his old life and taking on the mantle and responsibilities of a new life. And when he emerged from those waters, a dove came down, rested overhead, and said, "This is my beloved, in whom I am well pleased." Friends, Jesus' baptism is our baptism. We know that we are God's beloved own, in whom God is well pleased. And through that love and through that power, we can be renewed in the same way that Jesus was. My prayer for all of us is that we can look at what we are putting into the rivers of our lives. Is it that love and compassion and hope, or is it our greed and our fear and our pain? I worked with the Department of Environmental Quality in Oregon before I got into ministry, and what I learned is that while sometimes the solution to pollution is dilution, in most cases, whatever we pollute into the rivers that run through our lands winds up just somewhere downriver, somewhere at the river's bottom. And through bioaccumulation, those pollutants come back to bite us. If we can look at what we are depositing in the rivers of our own lives and our own relationships and clean that up, restoring the shores of our lives, planting deep roots of spiritual practices that keep our rivers healthy and safe and clean, we can experience the joy of renewal, of new light, of new hope, yet willing to break forth. My prayer for all of us, friends, is that the river of love that runs through us can restore and renew our communities and our larger world. God bless you all. Amen.